Jasmine Crockett just made the biggest mistake of her political career. She called Karoline Leavitt a distorter of the law right in the middle of a live, televised hearing. Big mistake. Leavitt fired back. Congresswoman Crockett, explain your own contradictory statements and the false data you've presented to the public. What happens next will bury Crockett's congressional credibility forever. Hit the like button because you're about to witness the most brutal political takedown in the history of hearings. An independent witness, brought forward by Leavitt on the spot, will reveal everything with undeniable evidence that will leave you stunned. Jasmine Crockett thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. When you attack a woman who's prepared every number and every file, you'd better brace for a fall. This is bigger than a typical political crisis. This is the day the U.S. Congress watched a young congresswoman single-handedly destroy her own career. It was supposed to be a routine hearing in Washington, D.C., but what happened next completely changed the political landscape in that room forever. Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the witness stand with a neatly organized stack of documents in hand, the lights shining down on her calm but resolute face. The room fell silent, the murmurs of reporters and aides fading as she began to speak. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, today I wish to present. She barely got a few sentences out before Jasmine Crockett lunged for the microphone, her voice sharp as a blade. You're distorting the law in front of the public. The bold accusation echoed through the room, cutting off Leavitt's statement and instantly turning the atmosphere from procedural to a battlefield. All eyes turned to the two women. One, the White House press secretary holding her ground at the podium. The other, a fiery young congresswoman determined not to let her opponent speak freely. The chairman frowned slightly. A few committee members exchanged glances, and reporters' cameras clicked furiously. The tension exploded from the very first second, making everyone forget that this was supposed to be a hearing about a new election bill. Crockett leaned into the microphone, not giving Leavitt a chance to continue. We can't start this discussion with such blatant misrepresentation. If you want to defend the administration, at least be honest about what the Constitution allows. Her attack wasn't just an interruption. It was a strategic first strike meant to disrupt Leavitt's rhythm and credibility in front of the media. Leavitt raised an eyebrow but didn't back down, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the podium, her eyes scanning the room, as if gauging the reaction. A few congressmen nodded in approval of Crockett's boldness, while others seemed annoyed by the aggressive interruption. Within minutes, the room was ablaze with tension, the air thick with confrontation. From that moment, everyone knew this hearing would no longer be a routine discussion, but a breathless battle of wits where every word could shift the balance. Karoline Leavitt took a deep breath, her voice steady as if she hadn't been interrupted, and continued presenting the constitutional principles tied to the election bill. But Jasmine Crockett had no intention of letting her get far. Just seconds after Leavitt resumed, Crockett interrupted again, this time not with an emotional accusation, but with a seemingly convincing quote from the Constitution itself. According to Article 1, Section 4, the U.S. Constitution clearly states that states have independent authority to establish their election processes. Miss Leavitt, you can't deny that. So what you're trying to justify here is nothing short of stripping states of their constitutional authority. Crockett's voice was firm, her tone like a lawyer in a courtroom, prompting several people in the room to nod instinctively. It seemed the young congresswoman had landed a legal blow strong enough to pin her opponent to the original text. Leavitt tilted her head slightly, her eyes not leaving her documents, then looked directly at Crockett. Her calm demeanor created a tense pause, as if she were weighing every word before launching her counterattack. Congresswoman, Leavitt said, her voice slow but firm. Article A, Section 4, which you just cited, does indeed grant states that authority, but the same provision also allows Congress to regulate or alter those rules when necessary. You mentioned the first half, but ignored the second, and that omitted part is the very basis for this bill. A heavy silence fell like an iron curtain. A few reporters whispered to each other. Some congressmen glanced at their copies of the law to verify. The reversal was stunning. The quote that seemed unassailable became a fatal flaw, exposing Crockett's selective use of the text to serve her argument. Without raising her voice, Leavitt had turned the tables by pointing out the overlooked detail. The room realized that Crockett's fiery attack had revealed a lack of precision. Crockett gripped the microphone tightly, her eyes flashing with unease but quickly regaining their resolve. I didn't ignore it. I was emphasizing the focus on state authority, she countered, trying to steer the debate back to her control. But Leavitt didn't let up. Emphasizing half, while ignoring the other half isn't emphasis. It's distortion, she said, her voice still calm but laced with steel. Each word landed like a hammer on wood. The room's mood shifted entirely. Initially, many thought Leavitt would falter under the sudden legal attack, but it was Crockett who lost her footing. Murmurs rose, and a few opposing committee members exchanged awkward glances. The chairman called for order, but his eyes followed Leavitt with barely concealed admiration. In that moment, the balance of power began to tip. Crockett, accustomed to using interruptions to corner her opponents, had inadvertently exposed a flaw in her own argument. Leavitt, on the other hand, used meticulous preparation and a firm grasp of legal details to turn the attack into an opportunity. The air grew heavier, but more gripping. Everyone understood that this was only the second interruption, and if the dynamics could shift this quickly, what lay ahead would surely be even more intense. Leavitt gathered her documents, placing them firmly on the podium to underscore her confidence, then calmly resumed her interrupted speech. But those watching knew this hearing had veered far from its starting point, and the real battle had just begun. Leavitt had barely regained her rhythm when Crockett leaned toward the microphone again, her voice slicing through like a cold arrow, aimed straight at her opponent's heart. If you want to talk about federal authority, then look at this number in the 2020 election. In over 30 counties in Texas, less than 1% of voters faced obstacles when voting. 1%, and you dare stand here trying to convince us that voter suppression is widespread or systemic. The truth is clear, that number is too small to justify any crisis. Her attack, backed by data, sounded like irrefutable evidence. As Crockett finished, the room buzzed again, eyes turning to Leavitt, waiting to see if she could respond to those cold, hard numbers. Leavitt didn't flinch. She opened a thick file already marked with tabs, flipping to a page as if she'd anticipated exactly which data Crockett would use. 1%, she repeated, her voice not loud but clear, is only half the truth. And half the truth, Congresswoman, can be more dangerous than a lie. The murmurs stopped instantly. The room fell into a silence, so tense it felt like a taut string about to snap. Leavitt held up the papers, her eyes locked on Crockett. You neglected to mention that this 1% figure comes only from counties required to report issues. Nearly 70 other counties didn't submit complete data. When you include those omitted cases and cross-reference with voter records, the obstacle rate jumps to 8%. 8% of Texas voters face difficulties exercising their most basic right. That's not a minor exception. It's a sign of a serious problem. A soft "oh" rose from the press section. Crockett faltered for a moment, her hand tapping the table as if trying to regain balance. Leavitt didn't stop. She flipped to another page, revealing a colorful chart. Not only that, you also overlooked a key detail. The majority of closed polling places were in communities of color and low-income areas. If you look at the full data, you'll see this unusual concentration. It's not random. It's a pattern. The counterattack was devastating. The data Crockett had wielded as a winning weapon turned into evidence against her. By cherry-picking numbers, Crockett had exposed her own vulnerability, and Leavitt capitalized on it. The hearing, which many expected to be a stage for Crockett's aggression, witnessed a stunning reversal from the one throwing punches. Crockett was now on the defensive. Crockett tried to regain control, leaning into the microphone with a sharp tone. I didn't ignore the data. I was providing an example to show that some areas function normally. You're exaggerating. But Leavitt cut her off, her voice calm yet firm. No, Congresswoman. You stood before this committee and said voter suppression affected 1%. That's cherry-picked data, used deliberately. And when the truth is revealed, it's not an example. It's distortion. A few committee members leaned back, whispering to each other. Crockett's face showed a flicker of tension. Her third interruption, meant to be a killing blow, had become a double-edged sword turned against her. Leavitt punctuated her point by firmly placing the file on the podium, the sharp sound startling the room. We're here to speak with full data, not fragments chosen for political gain. The atmosphere grew heavy. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked non-stop. Crockett's lips tightened, her eyes fixed forward, but the fire of her initial confidence had dimmed. Her political mettle had never been challenged so publicly. The room sensed the truth. The one who seemed to control the fight with relentless interruptions had exposed a fatal weakness, while the one repeatedly interrupted used meticulous preparation to flip the script. And when Leavitt paused, letting silence envelop the room. No one thought this was a routine hearing anymore. This was a battle of wits, and round 3 had just ended with the supposed attacker caught in a data distortion, while the interrupted stood stronger than ever. The room still echoed with the impact of the data counterattack when Jasmine Crockett pushed her chair forward slightly, her hand gripping the microphone tightly. The tension was etched on her face, and it was clear that Leavitt's reversal of evidence had thrown her off balance. But instead of diving deeper into the numbers, Crockett shifted tactics, choosing a new approach, attacking the person, their background, their age, and their experience. Her voice rose, sharp and deliberate. Who are we listening to here? A young White House spokesperson, barely in her 20s, with no political tenure, no years of experience in committees or on the floor. How can we take her opinions as seriously as those who've dedicated their careers to the law? Her words echoed through the room, no longer targeting the debate's substance, but aiming directly at Leavitt as a personal attack. A few nodded, perhaps agreeing with the appeal to experience. Some reporters jotted down notes, sensing fresh blood in the confrontation. Crockett didn't stop, her eyes locked on her opponent. You can read numbers, you can quote reports, but you haven't endured grueling hearings, haven't debated in Congress long enough to understand how the law works beyond theory. You're just a mouthpiece, a conduit for the administration, not someone who grasps the issue at its core. For a moment, the atmosphere shifted. Some audience members whispered. A few opposing congressmen smirked, as if their ally had regained balance. But Karoline Leavitt stood unmoved at the podium, her face steady. She leaned slightly forward, her hands resting on the polished wood, and spoke in an eerily calm voice. Congresswoman Crockett wants to talk about experience. Let's talk about experience. Leavitt opened a second file, this time not voter data, but a dense list of campaigns and cases she'd worked on. Before standing here, I worked in the White House communications team, leading dozens of press briefings before hundreds of reporters. I coordinated national information campaigns, where every word was scrutinized for accuracy and impact. She paused, then continued, her eyes fixed on Crockett. And before that, I worked on lawsuits related to voting rights, where we won against legal teams far more experienced. I may not have 30 years in a committee, but I have results. Results in winning cases and managing information, which the public can verify. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. Those who had been skeptical began to see Leavitt differently. Her specific record carried real weight, contrasting sharply with the vague attack on her age. Crockett raised an eyebrow, about to interject, but Leavitt raised her voice to hold the floor. Calling me young or inexperienced is just a way to dodge the substance. If experience is the only measure, should we dismiss every emerging leader just because they're young? But if effectiveness and results matter, I've proven I'm capable. This response tilted the room in her favor. A few congressmen exchanged nods, while reporters typed frantically, preparing for scorching headlines. The chairman watched both sides, his face neutral, but his attention clearly drawn to Leavitt's arguments. Crockett, unwilling to concede defeat, tried to interrupt again. But congressional experience. Leavitt cut her off firmly, her voice icy yet composed. Congresswoman, congressional experience doesn't justify distorting data or using personal attacks instead of evidence. I'm here not to prove my age, but to prove the truth. And the truth doesn't require decades of tenure to see. The room erupted in murmurs. This time, even the silent onlookers couldn't hold back their whispers of agreement. The mood had shifted decisively. The one belittled had turned the attack into a chance to affirm herself, while the attacker was exposed as relying on tactics rather than substance. In many eyes, Karoline Leavitt was no longer the young spokesperson, but a formidable opponent, using preparation and real achievements to counter every slight. The room's attitude had transformed. Instead of anticipating Crockett's attacks, they now awaited Leavitt's responses. Each counterstrike flipped the roles from the one constantly interrupted. Leavitt had made her opponent falter in her own personal attack strategy, and as she paused, her gaze sweeping the room, the air felt heavier but tilted firmly in her favor, signaling that the battle's dynamics were shifting with every passing minute. The atmosphere in the hearing room remained taut as a bowstring after the failed personal attack. Crockett sank back into her chair, gripping her pen tightly, her eyes still fixed on Karoline Leavitt at the podium. She knew she needed to change tactics, and this time, instead of direct attacks with data or personal jabs, Crockett chose a different procedure. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Her voice rang out, interrupting Leavitt just as the White House spokesperson began transitioning to the next part of her presentation. According to committee rules, a witness is not permitted to make speculative statements about the intentions of states. She held her head high, her eyes gleaming with triumph, as if she had found a loophole to halt Leavitt, perhaps even get her reprimanded. The chairman tilted his head slightly toward Crockett, while Leavitt furrowed her brow but stood firm. Instead of faltering, she responded, her voice unwavering. "I'm merely reading data from an official report." Crockett didn't let it go. "Point of order," she repeated, a second time, then a third, each time citing a minor procedural rule, from limits on speaking time to regulations on document citations. Her goal was clear: to prevent Leavitt from maintaining her argument's momentum, forcing her to get bogged down in a maze of technicalities. A few committee members began to look confused. Onlookers whispered, "Was Leavitt truly trapped?" Crockett gave a half smile, believing she had found a way to regain control. She pressed further. "Point of order. The witness is exceeding the scope of the question, and that's a violation of the rules." All eyes turned to Leavitt. But instead of backing down, she reached for another file, flipping quickly to pages pre-marked with yellow tabs. Her voice rang out clearly, each word deliberate. According to the committee's charter, Section 3, Paragraph 5, a witness is permitted to present additional information when it directly relates to the hearing subject. That's exactly what I'm doing. This rule was adopted in 2019 and has never been amended. The room froze. Several congressmen immediately leaned down to check their documents for verification. The chairman, after a brief silence, nodded slightly. "That is correct." His short statement carried enough weight to collapse Crockett's procedural tactic in an instant. Leavitt didn't stop. She flipped to another page, holding it up for all to see. Furthermore, Section 4, Paragraph 2 clearly states that repeated points of order on the same grounds may be deemed excessive disruption. I believe the Congresswoman has raised at least 3 unnecessary repetitions. With that, she closed the file with a sharp snap, as if ending the entire game. Crockett sat rigid, her half-smile vanishing. The tactic she thought would bind her opponent had become a trap that ensnared her instead. The whispers now shifted. "She knows the rules word for word," one reporter murmured. "Not just prepared with data, but with the regulations too." The room's atmosphere transformed. Committee members, previously drawn into the procedural debate, now looked at Leavitt with clear respect. Instead of being passive, she proved she had studied the rules down to the letter, and that meant Crockett, with all her ferocity, had just exposed her own lack of preparation in the very arena she chose to exploit. Leavitt tilted her head, her voice not loud but piercing. "I respect procedure, but procedure shouldn't be weaponized to block the truth. And if the Congresswoman wants to use it as a weapon, she should at least ensure she's read all the clauses." The murmurs in the room turned into soft chuckles, not out of humor, but from the stark reversal. Crockett had trapped herself in her own net, and from that moment, no one doubted that Leavitt had ascended to a new level from the one constantly interrupted. She became the one who turned each interruption into proof of her meticulous preparation and unshakable resolve. After being cornered by her own point of order ploy, Jasmine Crockett refused to back down. She sat up straight, took a deep breath as if to reclaim her confidence, and suddenly leaned toward the microphone. Her voice rang out, this time no longer circling data or rules but aiming straight at Karoline Leavitt's ethics. "What concerns me, Mr. Chairman, is not just how Miss Leavitt cites data or regulations. What concerns me is that she's standing here to cover up serious misconduct by the administration. When a White House spokesperson stands before this committee, can we trust she'll tell the truth, or is she just a mouthpiece hiding actions that infringe on voting rights?" The room shook. This was no longer about technicalities or legal debates, but a direct accusation against Leavitt's moral character. All eyes zeroed in on her. Crockett pressed on, her voice rapid. "You're not a neutral scholar, you're a spokesperson. Your job isn't to uncover the truth, it's to conceal it. And in that role, you lack the credibility to persuade this committee." The attack landed like a hammer, targeting integrity, the only foundation a witness can rely on. For a moment, the room reached peak tension. Some committee members leaned down to confer with aides. Reporters typed furiously. Crockett thought she had turned the tide. But Leavitt didn't rush to respond. She calmly opened her leather briefcase on the podium, pulling out a thick file marked with colorful sticky notes. Placing it on the polished wood, she looked up, her voice firm but not raised. If we're talking about truth and integrity, let's start with what's been publicly recorded. Leavitt flipped to the first page, holding up a printout. On March 12th last year, Congresswoman Crockett stated on television that there's no clear evidence of systemic polling place closures in Texas. Yet 3 months later, on June 25th, at a voter rally, she claimed we're facing the worst polling place closure crisis in modern history. Two statements from the same person, less than a summer apart. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Leavitt didn't stop. She turned to another page, bolded text highlighted. On September 14th, in an internal discussion, Ms. Crockett asserted that data on voter suppression wasn't sufficient to draw conclusions. But on October 2nd, she appeared on national television, declaring undeniable evidence. Each time she finished reading, Leavitt firmly placed a sheet on the table, the sharp thud, like a drum beat, startling the room. No one expected Leavitt to have prepared such a detailed file. Every contradiction in Crockett's statements came with dates, sources, and even video references. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the rustle of pages and Leavitt's increasingly steady voice. "Congresswoman Crockett accuses me of hiding the truth," she said, eyes locked on her opponent. But she's the one who changes her story, depending on where she speaks. One way before this committee, another before the public. That's the contradiction voters need to know. Crockett flushed, trying to interrupt. "I never denied," but Leavitt raised her hand to hold the microphone. "Please let me finish. If you're accusing me of covering up, then explain to the public why, in less than 6 months, you've given 3 different takes on the same issue." The counterattack struck Crockett's weakest point, one she hadn't anticipated being exploited. Her moral attack, meant to be the final blow, became a trap that ensnared her. By exposing Crockett's public contradictions, Leavitt dismantled the cover-up accusation. Who was really concealing? Who was shifting tones for political gain? Some congressmen flipped through their documents. Reporters zoomed in on Crockett's tense face. The chairman, after a brief pause, tapped his gavel lightly. "Congresswoman, please maintain order. The witness has the right to complete her statement." His reminder added weight to the momentum. Leavitt had just seized. She closed the file, resting her hands on it, her voice lowering. "The truth doesn't need to be hidden, and the truth can be verified by the very words spoken. I'm not here to cover for anyone. I'm here to defend the data and expose the contradictions the Congresswoman doesn't want mentioned." In that moment, the room realized Leavitt hadn't just defended against the ethical accusation. She turned it into a chance to strike at her opponent's credibility. Crockett, from accuser, became the one in the hot seat. The shock spread, not just from Leavitt's meticulous preparation, but from her use of Crockett's own public words to flip the entire dynamic. Jasmine Crockett sat silent in her chair, her hands clenched into fists. Her face tried to maintain its resolve, but the red flush on her cheeks betrayed the frustration boiling within. 6 interruptions. 6 times she thought she had cornered her opponent. Yet each time Karoline Leavitt turned the attack into an advantage. Unwilling to lose control, Crockett leaned toward the microphone, ready to interrupt a 7th time. But before she could speak, Leavitt looked up, her eyes blazing under the lights, her hand raised in a firm gesture. Her voice echoed, clear, cold, and resolute. "You've interrupted me 6 times, Congresswoman. But this time, I have a question for you." The room fell silent, as if someone had muted all sound. Pens stopped scribbling. Cameras zoomed in on the two facing off. The air grew heavy, tense, so thick you could hear the faint breaths from the front row. For the first time since the hearing began, Crockett was no longer in control. Leavitt had seized the microphone, and everyone knew the tide had turned. Crockett blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the boldness. This wasn't a defensive response like before. This was an open counterattack. She leaned forward, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Your question? I thought a witness's job was to answer, not question a member of Congress." Leavitt didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone, each word deliberate, like a judge's gavel. "My job is to defend the truth. And to do that, I have the right to ask you to clarify the contradictions in your own statements. So, with your permission, I'll ask Congresswoman Crockett, can you explain to this committee why, on the same issue, you've taken 3 different stances in just 6 months?" Murmurs erupted, then died, as the chairman tapped his gavel. All eyes turned to Crockett. She blinked, her lips parting as if to retort, but the words caught in her throat. This blow was different from the previous 6. It wasn't an empty accusation or a procedural trick. It was a public, direct question aimed at her fatal flaw. the contradictions in her own words. Leavitt didn't stop. Her voice was steady, sharp. You said there's no evidence of voter suppression, then 3 months later called it the worst crisis. You said the data wasn't enough, then claimed undeniable evidence. Congresswoman, which version should the public believe? A sigh echoed from the audience. Crockett tried to interrupt, her voice urgent. I didn't deny what I said, but Leavitt cut her off, unyielding. No, please answer directly. 3 different claims, 3 conflicting messages. Do you have evidence to prove you're not shifting your stance for political gain? For the first time, Crockett was forced to answer, rather than question. Her face showed a flicker of unease, her eyes darting across the crowd as if seeking an escape. But there was none, just the heavy silence of the room waiting for her response. Leavitt let the silence linger for a few seconds, then lowered her voice, emphasizing, You've interrupted me 6 times, Congresswoman. But now, it's your turn to face a question. No more interruptions, no more procedures, just the truth, in front of the public. The chairman's gavel tapped again, not to stop Leavitt, but to demand Crockett's response. Congresswoman, please address the question, he said. Crockett bit her lip, struggling to muster composure. I emphasized different aspects of the issue, in different contexts, she stammered, but the response sounded more like an excuse than a solid argument. Leavitt immediately fired back. You call that emphasizing. The public calls it contradiction. And in politics, contradiction means a loss of credibility. The room erupted in fervent whispers. Some congressmen nodded slightly. Reporters exchanged excited glances. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Crockett was no longer the aggressor, but the one forced to defend. Leavitt looked straight at Crockett, her voice icy. I'll let you interrupt me 6 times, but this 7th time, I'm the one asking, and I won't stop until the public gets a clear answer. In that moment, control slipped from Crockett's hands and fully into Leavitt's. The room's atmosphere sank, heavy, as if everyone realized this was the turning point of the hearing. The one interrupted had become the one in command, and everyone understood. Karoline Leavitt's full-scale counterattack had just begun. Karoline Leavitt didn't let the silence linger. As the room buzzed with murmurs over her unexpected question, she reached for another thick file stamped in bold red. Internal Report, Federal Election Statistics and Oversight Agency. The title alone made several people lean forward. It was the very agency Jasmine Crockett frequently cited in debates, treating it as the cornerstone of her arguments. Leavitt placed the file on the podium, the pages rustling in the quiet room. She held up a color-printed chart, her voice resolute. This is data never widely released, but it comes directly from the agency Congresswoman Crockett cites daily. And this number, Honorable Committee, completely dismantles the argument she just made. All eyes turned to the chart. Leavitt pointed to a column dense with figures. Ms. Crockett claimed the voter obstacle rate is only 1%, even calling it insignificant. But this agency's full report shows that, when including counties that didn't submit complete data, the actual average rate is 8.4%. And in minority communities, that rate spikes to nearly 15%. This isn't a random issue. It's a systemic pattern. Murmurs erupted across the room. Congressmen exchanged hurried words. Reporters zoomed in on the pages. Crockett sat frozen, her hand gripping her pen, eyes wide in disbelief. The agency she often cited had produced data that directly contradicted her claims. Leavitt flipped to another page, her voice growing more assertive. And that's not all. This report also shows that from 2016 to 2022, over 70% of closed polling places were in areas with over 50% minority voters. If this isn't deliberate targeting, what do we call it? The chairman's gavel tapped lightly, not to interrupt Leavitt, but to signal the audience to maintain order as the witness continued. No one doubted that a pivotal moment had arrived. Crockett tried to interject, her voice urgent. I need to review that data source. It's not certain. But Leavitt cut her off. This data has been available to you for months. It comes from the very agency you cite. You had full access but chose to ignore the inconvenient parts. That's not an oversight. It's deliberate cherry-picking. A soft O rose from the back rows. Some congressmen nodded, those previously on the fence, now leaning toward Leavitt. The pages of the report lay spread out on the podium, bold numbers, colorful charts, forming an undeniable picture. Leavitt pressed on, her voice stronger than ever. When Ms. Crockett says there's no evidence of systemic voter suppression. She looked at data fragments and ignored the full picture. But the public doesn't need fragments. The public needs the full truth. And the truth is, millions of voters faced obstacles. Not a few hundred, not 1%, but millions. The room fell silent. Crockett shifted, trying to interrupt. But her microphone was muted by the chairman. "Congresswoman, please let the witness finish." In that moment, the balance of power shifted entirely. Crockett, the relentless interrupter from the start, was forced to stay silent, while Leavitt, once constantly cut off, now held full control of the microphone. Leavitt lowered her voice, but the certainty in her words made the air heavier. "I don't need personal attacks or procedural tricks. I just need the data. And the data here clearly shows Congresswoman Crockett's arguments don't hold up." The reversal was stark. Not only did Leavitt refute her opponent, she used the very agency Crockett relied on to flip the narrative. Crockett bowed her head over her papers, lips pursed, unable to muster a retort. All her efforts to control the hearing vanished like smoke. Leavitt gathered her charts, stacking them neatly, then looked up at the room. "This isn't a fight between two individuals," she said, her voice resounding, "but a fight between truth and distortion. And today, the truth has spoken." The room's atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was a mix of awe and admiration. Committee members, previously silent, now whispered among themselves, their faces showing agreement. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, capturing every word, every number. Crockett sat motionless, her eyes vacant. She had believed that interrupting and cherry-picking data would fluster her opponent. But now, in front of everyone, she was the one exposed. Leavitt stood firm, as if the entire script had been calculated from the start. 6 interruptions only made her wait for the perfect moment to deliver a devastating data-driven counterattack. And now, as the room witnessed the collapse of her opponent's arguments, no one doubted that Karoline Leavitt had fully taken control of the hearing. The room was still buzzing from the numbers Karoline Leavitt had just unleashed. The color-printed charts, the startling percentages, all left many congressmen sitting like statues, while Jasmine Crockett clutched her pen awkwardly, lips pursed as if searching for an escape. But Leavitt wasn't done. She stood taller, her sharp gaze sweeping across the row of congressmen, then suddenly raised her hand. "Mr. Chairman, with the committee's permission, I'd like to introduce an independent witness who was involved in collecting and analyzing the data I just presented. He is here in the room today, and I believe his testimony will confirm what the numbers have already shown." The room erupted in gasps. This wasn't part of the announced hearing agenda. The chairman frowned, momentarily surprised, then after a brief hesitation nodded. "If the witness was pre-registered with the clerk, proceed." Leavitt gave a slight nod, signaling a man to rise from the back row. He wore a simple gray suit, holding a file as thick as Leavitt's. As he stepped to the secondary podium, the room's tension was palpable. Leavitt introduced him briefly. "This is Dr. Alan Whitford, an election statistics expert who worked directly with the Federal Election Statistics and Oversight Agency. He was part of the team that analyzed the data Congresswoman Crockett often cites." Murmurs rose again, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras zooming in. No one expected Leavitt to have prepared a trump card witness, appearing at the precise moment the tide was turning in her favor. Crockett shot up, her voice cutting in. "This is completely unexpected. This witness wasn't on the list." But the chairman interrupted. "Dr. Whitford's name is in the appendix submitted last night. The Congresswoman may question him after his statement." Whitford adjusted the microphone, his voice calm and professional. "Honorable Committee, I confirm that the data Ms. Leavitt presented fully aligns with the findings our team collected. Indeed, the average voter obstacle rate is far higher than the 1% figure often cited. In particular, the concentration of closed polling places in minority communities is an undeniable reality." His affirmation hit like a hammer. An independent expert, who worked with the very agency Crockett frequently cited, now publicly confirmed that Leavitt's data was comprehensive. This was no longer just a spokesperson's words. It was evidence backed by a witness no one could easily dismiss. Crockett tried to interject, her voice higher than usual. "You could be biased, Miss. Leavitt clearly chose you because you agree with." But Whitford responded calmly. "I serve no administration or party. I'm an independent analyst. My job is to clarify data, not to support anyone's argument. And the data, when examined comprehensively, clearly shows that what Ms. Crockett presented is a fragment that doesn't reflect the true situation. A new wave of murmurs erupted. Several congressmen turned to confer quickly with their aides. Reporters panned to capture Crockett's rigid posture, her eyes darting as if seeking something to cling to. For the first time, her sharp confidence slipped from her face, replaced by visible unease. Leavitt didn't miss her chance. She stepped to the witness table, placing another file down. This is 200 pages of detailed analysis provided by Dr. Whitford before this hearing. I move to include it in the committee's official record. The chairman nodded, and the clerk promptly accepted it. In that moment, everyone understood. Leavitt didn't just come with data. She came with an ally, a trump card no one anticipated. The trap had flipped. The one who confidently interrupted 6 times now sat silently as the agency she cited dismantled her arguments. Whitford concluded with a brief but powerful statement. We can debate political implications, but we cannot debate the numbers, and the numbers show the truth. The gavel struck again, this time affirming that the testimony was recorded. The room's atmosphere sank, heavy with weight. Everyone realized this was no longer a duel between 2 women, but a hearing where truth was validated by an independent witness. Leavitt returned to the main podium, her stance steady, her voice lowering. Honorable committee, I don't need accusations. I just need evidence. And the evidence has stood up to speak for itself. Her gaze locked onto Crockett. For a brief moment, Crockett seemed poised to retort, but then fell silent, her hands clenched beneath the table. A long silence enveloped the room. The silence of a dynamic irrevocably shifted. Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the file doctor. Alan Whitford had just submitted to the committee. Her breathing was heavy, her face flushed with anger. In her mind, every prepared scenario had collapsed when Leavitt unexpectedly played her witness card. But Crockett refused to stay silent any longer. She flicked on her microphone, her voice higher than usual, trying to reclaim control. Mr. Chairman, I object. This witness cannot be considered independent. He clearly prepared with Miss Leavitt. Bringing him here is a staged attempt to legitimize biased data. Murmurs rose again. Some congressmen leaned forward, waiting for Leavitt's response. Whitford, now seated in the witness row, remained calm, his expression neutral. Leavitt took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice not loud but weighted. Congresswoman Crockett, you're accusing an independent scientist of bias simply because his data doesn't align with your stance. But the truth is different. Dr. Whitford has worked under both Democratic and Republican administrations. He was invited to advise the 2015 Election Reform Committee when your party controlled the House. Public records confirm this. Leavitt held up a new set of papers, seals and signatures clearly visible. This is Dr. Whitford's 2015 appointment letter, issued under a Democratic House Speaker. If this is bias, are you implying your own party once trusted an unobjective expert? A ripple of murmurs spread like a wave. Crockett faltered slightly, her lips trembling, but she pushed back. That doesn't prove he's fully neutral today. Clearly, he worked with Miss Leavitt to prepare this data. Leavitt gave a faint smile, as if anticipating this move. She pulled out another document, this time a signed letter from the Federal Election Statistics and Oversight Agency. Honorable Committee, this is a statement from the agency confirming that Dr. Whitford remains on their list of independent consultants. This was submitted before the hearing and can be verified on their official website. I didn't prepare this witness. I followed proper procedure to invite an authorized expert to speak, and this agency, the one Congresswoman Crockett constantly cites, approved his testimony. The murmurs stopped. An uneasy silence blanketed the room. All eyes turned to Crockett, waiting for her response. Crockett gritted her teeth, her trembling hand touching the microphone. Evidence can be distorted. Even official agencies can be swayed by political pressure. This was a fatal mistake. Leavitt seized the opportunity, her voice striking like an arrow. Congresswoman Crockett, less than an hour ago, you stood here citing this very agency to support your stance, calling it an undeniable data source. Yet now, when it presents data against you, you suddenly claim it's politically manipulated. That's the definition of a double standard. Gasps echoed from multiple corners. Crockett's mouth opened, but no words came out. The twist was glaring. Her resistance was not only weak, but contradicted her own earlier statements. Leavitt pressed on, her voice growing more confident. You can't cite an agency when it suits you, then turn your back when it refutes you. If that's not dishonesty, what would the public call it? The room sank into heavy silence. Crockett looked around, hoping for a nod of support, but found only cold or averted gazes. Her allies stayed silent, offering no defense. Leavitt closed her file, her voice lowering but still sharp. Congresswoman Crockett, you interrupted me 6 times, accused me of distorting the law, cherry-picking data, even covering up misconduct. But each time you attacked, the truth proved otherwise. And today, when you accuse both the witness and the agency you often cite of bias, you've shown you have no arguments left to stand on. The chairman tapped his gavel lightly, the room's tension almost suffocating. This time, it wasn't to stop Leavitt, but to call for order for the next presentation. But it was clear the tide had turned. Crockett slumped into her chair, her shoulders trembling, her eyes dimmed with defeat. The more she tried to shift the narrative, the deeper she fell into a spiral of contradictions. Meanwhile, Leavitt stood tall, not only defending successfully, but turning every attack into evidence bolstering her credibility. What began as an uneven fight had become a testament to a truth. The more desperately one attacks, the more they expose their own weaknesses. And Crockett, who once dominated the microphone with 6 interruptions, now sat silently, bound by her own impatience. The room's atmosphere remained thick. After Karoline Leavitt dismantled the bias accusations Jasmine Crockett hurled, Crockett slumped in her chair, still clutching the papers in front of her, as if they could shield her from the piercing stares. But Leavitt wasn't finished. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice lower, but each word cutting through the air like a blade. Honorable Committee, when discussing the reliability of witnesses and data, I cannot overlook precedent, because precedent shows us who maintains consistency and who does not. Leavitt paused briefly, opening a new, neatly organized file marked with red tabs. On November 7th, 2 years ago, she began, her eyes locked on Crockett. Congresswoman Crockett appeared at a local press conference and stated that early voting rates in Dallas suburban counties showed no signs of suppression. Her words were recorded, broadcast live. Murmurs rippled through the room. Crockett flinched, her face flushing, her hands gripping the microphone tightly. Leavitt continued without hesitation, but just 3 weeks later, in a national TV interview, she claimed Dallas suburban counties are a prime example of voter suppression strategies. Same area, same data, but 2 completely contradictory statements. The chairman's gavel tapped, calling for order, but the room's tension was taut as a bowstring. Everyone could see Crockett's shaky stance being publicly exposed. Leavitt placed the file firmly on the podium, the sound echoing in the uneasy silence. I asked Congresswoman Crockett, what's the truth? When you told local voters there was no issue, or when you stood before the nation painting a crisis? If the truth can change in a matter of weeks, what can we trust from you? Crockett opened her mouth but closed it immediately. Her face burned red, her eyes flickering as if searching for an escape, but no words came. The prolonged silence was more damning than any defense. Leavitt didn't need to press further. She stepped back slightly, her gaze unwavering, her voice calm. The truth isn't a political choice. It either exists or it doesn't. And each time you shift your statement to suit your audience, you leave a trail. Today, I'm just pointing out that trail. The room fell dead silent. Every breath seemed held. Crockett bowed her head, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. This time, no one dared interrupt or rescue her. The jab at her past had struck a fatal blow, and the young congresswoman had nothing left to counter. The hearing room's atmosphere remained heavy as lead after Karoline Leavitt dredged up the Dallas incident. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her face flushed, her hands trembling with tension. But Leavitt wasn't done. She stood tall, her eyes blazing, then slowly gathered all the files scattered on the podium into a neat stack. As she placed her hand on them, her voice rang out clearly, retracing the entire battle from the start. Honorable Committee, today we've witnessed Congresswoman Crockett interrupt me 6 times. 6 times she tried to dominate, derail, and shift the narrative, but all 6 times left evidence to the contrary. Let's review. The room fell silent, all eyes following her. Leavitt opened the first file, her voice steady. The first interruption, she accused me of distorting the law. But when compared to the full text, I showed she cited only half the clause, ignoring the part where the Constitution allows Congress to regulate elections. She called me the distorter, but she was the one cherry-picking. She placed the file down firmly and opened the next. The second time, she used a 1% figure to claim no crisis existed. I presented the full report, showing the real number was 8.4%, doubling in minority communities. She offered a fragment. I provided the whole picture. Result, the truth was exposed. Leavitt continued, her voice growing firmer. The third time, she attacked me personally, calling me young and inexperienced. But I presented my record, from communications campaigns to successful lawsuits. Experience isn't measured by age, but by results. And I proved my results. A few pens tapped lightly in the congressional rows, signaling agreement. Leavitt didn't stop, flipping to the fourth section. The fourth time, she used procedure, repeatedly calling point of orders to obstruct. But I cited the charter on the spot, proving her repetitions were unnecessary and against the rules. She tried to trap me with procedure, but ended up caught in her own. She lowered her voice slightly, her gaze piercing Crockett. The fifth time, she accused me of covering up misconduct. But I presented her own contradictory statements, claiming no evidence of suppression, then calling it a crisis. Her words turned against her. I didn't need to defend myself. I just repeated what she said. The tension was palpable. Leavitt paused briefly, then continued, her voice sharp as a blade. The sixth time, she accused my witness of bias, but that witness was appointed by her own party, and the agency she cites confirmed his independence. She called him manipulated, yet earlier she hailed that agency as an undeniable data source. 6 times, 6 self-contradictions. Leavitt paused, staring directly at Crockett. The young Congresswoman's face paled, her gaze unfocused. The room was so quiet that a reporter's page turn at the back echoed. Leavitt clasped her hands behind her back, her voice resounding like a verdict. Congresswoman Crockett, 6 interruptions. 6 times you thought you had control, but 6 times became 6 public proofs of your inconsistency. You say A, I have B. You say C, I have D. And so it went, each attack turning into a counterstrike. That's not coincidence. That's preparation. That's truth defended. The effect rippled through the room. Some congressmen nodded slightly. Others crossed their arms, their eyes betraying barely concealed admiration. Reporters typed frantically, headlines forming in their minds. Crockett sat there, her cheeks burning, hands clenched, unable to muster a single rebuttal. Leavitt closed her file, her eyes blazing. 6 interruptions, 6 public failures. And if there's a 7th, I promise you, it won't just be a failure. It will be the end. The room fell utterly silent, only the thumping heartbeats of those watching audible. Everyone felt it. The battle had shifted entirely. Crockett was no longer the aggressor, but a living testament to the truth that, when meticulously defended, can turn every attack into a weapon against itself. The room's atmosphere was so thick no one dared breathe heavily. 6 interruptions, 6 counterattacks, all just woven by Karoline Leavitt into a chain of public defeats for Jasmine Crockett. Sweat beaded on the young Congresswoman's forehead, her trembling hands brushing the microphone as if trying to interrupt once more. And as predicted, Crockett leaned forward, her lips parting, poised to launch a 7th interruption. But this time, Leavitt didn't allow it. She leaned in, raising her hand to halt her, her eyes locked on her opponent, her voice cut through the air, cold as a blade. You've interrupted me 6 times without a shred of evidence. This is the 7th, and it proves you have nothing left but interruptions. In that moment, the room sank into a deadly silence. The soft tapping of a reporter's pen stopped abruptly. Some gasped, as if unable to believe what they'd just heard. Each of Leavitt's words hit the wooden floor like a hammer, the air trembling as if under a verdict. Crockett opened her mouth, but then closed it. Every prepared retort seemed to dissolve. For the first time since the hearing began, she sat motionless, her eyes wide, her face pale. Every gaze in the room, from congressmen, reporters, to spectators, was fixed on that moment. Leavitt didn't let it pass. She leaned down, opened her final file, her voice low but resonant with each word. I've endured interruptions. I've faced accusations. I've heard cherry-picked data, repeated procedures, personal attacks, and even charges of cover-up. But each time, I had evidence. Miss Crockett has nothing but interruptions, and that honorable committee says it all. A soft "oh" rose from the audience, then faded instantly. The chairman, stern-faced, tapped his gavel lightly to maintain order, but he couldn't hide the thoughtful look he cast toward Leavitt. Leavitt took a step further, her voice turning steely. We're discussing the voting rights of millions of citizens. This isn't a stage for someone to grab the microphone just to perform. This is where data, evidence, and truth must speak. 6 interruptions were 6 wastes of time, and this 7th is an admission that my opponent has nothing in her hands. The room fell utterly silent. Crockett sat still, her hand leaving the microphone, her eyes fixed on the papers before her. But clearly, she had no will to flip another page. No one interjected. No one came to her rescue. Even her political allies, usually quick to cheer, sat motionless, as if witnessing a collapse right before their eyes. Leavitt closed her file, her voice lowering but ringing like a verdict. Interruptions aren't evidence. Repetition isn't an argument. And shouting isn't truth. If this is the strategy Miss Crockett chose, today it has exposed its own emptiness. The gavel struck again, but this time, no one noticed. All eyes were still on Leavitt, feeling the weight of her just-delivered shutdown. Some congressmen leaned back, sighing. A few reporters exchanged glances, nodding silently. They knew they had just witnessed a defining moment, not just in this hearing, but in the political careers of both figures. In that silence, Crockett bowed her head, her hair obscuring part of her face. She no longer reacted, no longer interrupted. The 7th interruption she intended, instead of landing a decisive blow, became the marker of her complete defeat. Leavitt, in contrast, stood firm at the podium, her gaze steady. She needed no more words. What she had just said was the linchpin, the closing statement, sharp, definitive, leaving no room for rebuttal. The room remained silent, absorbing each word before the chairman's gavel closed the debate. But in the minds of everyone present, the real full stop had been placed when Leavitt said, "You have nothing but interruptions." The shutdown rang out like a blade slicing through the air. After Karoline Leavitt's decisive words, Jasmine Crockett sat frozen. The microphone in front of her still glowed, but no sound came. Her lips pressed tightly, her eyes averted, staring at the stack of papers on her desk. Her fingers tapped erratically, as if seeking something to grasp, then fell limp, powerless. An eerie silence enveloped the room. This wasn't the usual pause to yield the floor. It was the silence of a shifted dynamic, of a battle where one side had run out of words. The murmurs that had buzzed since the start of the hearing vanished, replaced by a tense anticipation, heavy as a storm cloud over the ceiling. The chairman, who had patiently maintained balance throughout the hearing, finally leaned toward his microphone. His voice came slowly, with a hint of hesitation. "Thank you, both of you. I propose we return to the official agenda of this session. Witness Leavitt, please continue with the remainder of your presentation." His intervention marked an end to the verbal duel. No one mentioned an 8th interruption. Crockett sat there, still trying to project calm, but clearly she had been sidelined from the game. The chairman's gavel tapped 3 times, as if emphasizing the need to steer the hearing back on track. But no matter how he tried, every eye in the room remained on Leavitt. Leavitt stood tall, adjusting the files on the podium, then spoke again. "As I said from the start, this election bill isn't about seizing power, but expanding protections for citizens' rights. I'd like to continue by proving this with specific cases from 5 key states." Her voice didn't need to rise or strain. Each word carried a different weight in a room now transformed. Unlike before, no one interrupted. Crockett sat silent, her microphone dark. Committee members, even those who had leaned toward her, now listened quietly. The shift was so stark that even seasoned reporters noticed, slowly panning their cameras to capture the moment of power reversal. An older congressman quietly wiped his brow with a handkerchief, glancing at Crockett as if to offer encouragement, but then stopped, knowing no gesture could salvage the heavy silence weighing on her. A few others nodded subtly to Leavitt's words, a reaction unimaginable 30 minutes earlier. The room's atmosphere had changed entirely. At the start, everyone expected Crockett to dominate, wielding sharp interruptions. Now they awaited Leavitt's every word. Her patience, meticulous preparation, and perfect takedown had turned her from a passive witness into the one steering the entire hearing. Leavitt continued citing studies, opening more chart pages, her voice steady and confident, no longer needing to defend against attacks. She devoted her time to building her case. Each new piece of evidence drew a few more nods from the committee. These were undeniable reactions, signs that the balance had tipped decisively. Crockett, in contrast, sank deeper into silence. At times, she looked up, her eyes flashing with intent to reclaim the microphone, but her hand retreated, as if she knew any effort now would only deepen her embarrassment. The entire room felt it. The one who interrupted 6 times, who sparked the atmosphere, was now locked in silence. The chairman occasionally tapped his gavel to maintain rhythm, but unlike before, he no longer needed to intervene in heated disputes. Instead, he had to ensure the hearing didn't fall into an overly still state, too focused on a single voice. In the audience, whispers faded entirely. People sat upright, eyes fixed on Leavitt, as if afraid to miss a detail. Everyone understood the battle in this room was over, and the rest was mere formality. A veteran reporter scribbled in their notebook. The turning point wasn't the data or the witness, but the 7th interruption stopped cold. That's when the balance fell entirely to one side. Those scrawled words might become tomorrow's headline, but for now they were just evidence of what everyone saw. Leavitt had seized absolute control. When Leavitt paused to sip water, the room remained dead silent, a silence of acknowledgement. Crockett didn't speak. The congressman didn't question, and the chairman, after a brief glance around, could only say, "Please, witness, continue." But everyone knew, whether she continued or not, the real battle was over. The room's atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer Crockett's stage, but Leavitt's, and there, she stood alone, unshaken, while her opponents sank into irretrievable silence. When the chairman's final gavel struck, the hearing concluded. Scattered notes and thick files remained on the polished table. Karoline Leavitt leaned down, gathering her documents, as if she knew she had completed not just a presentation, but a battle. Even in that quiet moment, her posture remained upright, steady, her eyes sharp, not at all like a witness who had endured relentless attacks. Instead, she looked like someone who had walked through a storm unscathed. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her eyes avoiding everyone, her fingers still clutching her pen but unable to write a single line. The 6 interruptions that once made her think she held the upper hand had become 6 pieces of evidence against her. And the 7th, Leavitt's razor-sharp shutdown, had slammed shut every door of rebuttal. The room's atmosphere brimmed with an unspoken acknowledgement. Power didn't lie in grabbing the microphone, in sharp tones or procedural tricks, but in preparation, data, and above all, the resolve to hold one's ground amid chaos. Those watching would carry this image. A Karoline Leavitt unwavering, ready to turn every attack into a chance to solidify her position. Leavitt neatly packed her files into her briefcase, then looked up at the room. No more words were needed. The silence of her opponent, the room's absolute attention, said it all. A few congressmen nodded subtly in recognition. Some reporters scribbled final lines in their notebooks. Everyone knew this moment would echo far beyond the confines of that wooden room. She stepped slowly from the podium, leaving behind a space once noisy but now silent. Each step seemed to etch the hearing's message deeper. Preparation, plus data, plus resolve, triumphs over interruptions, plus attacks. No need to shout, no need to seize the microphone, just truth and composure. And in the end, truth prevails. As the hearing room's door closed, a narrative seemed to rise in the minds of all present. That was the moment Karoline Leavitt turned 6 interruptions into 6 proofs of failure, and the 7th into a knockout blow. The message closed, but its echo lingered, like a verdict, a lesson, and an indelible milestone in the history of dramatic hearings. Thank you for following this gripping showdown, where truth and resolve triumphed over interruptions and attacks. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch the next debates. See you in the next video.